The Knights Templar essentially created the first ATM. We're talking about the 12th century, much earlier than most of us would think of as, the time when the ATM comes into regular use. But the idea of the ATM, the idea that you can put money in to an institution and withdraw it from multiple places, no matter where you are in the world, the Knights Templar made that happen.
This is Dr. Dorsey Armstrong. She's a professor of English and medieval literature at Purdue University. You might have seen her on videos like this, and I couldn't have asked for a better expert to talk about medieval financial history. This is the story of the Knights Templar and how they created the first ATM. Now, many of us know the Knights Templar as these elite military units from the Great Crusades. But wait, let's back up for a second. Who are the Knights Templar, and what were the Great Crusades again?
Very quick history lesson. The Crusades are called in the West in 1095. Western forces set out for the Holy Land with the idea of retaking it for Christendom. They, much to their own surprise, actually conquered Jerusalem in 1099. I don't think they expected to be successful. And they set up what are called the Crusader states in what we think of as the Holy Land. And this is Tripoli, Antioch, Odessa, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And what happens is when these states are established, lots of pilgrims from the West want to come visit these holy places. And while it might be safe for them to, say, walk around Jerusalem, getting there is a little more dangerous. And in fact, when they are in the Holy Land, there are numerous instances where they go outside the realms of a Crusader state and get attacked by the locals who are none too happy that their lands have been conquered. So the Templars come into existence because a group of knights, and what's important is that they are from mostly France, so they're mostly French. They say, we need to create an order whose job is to protect the innocent people who are traveling to the Holy Land.
Now we imagine the Knights Templar as these elaborate soldiers wearing the best armor and riding the best horses to battle. However, that was only in the latter years when the order grew in influence and power. So why exactly were they entrusted with creating an ATM structure? I'm going to get to that in a bit, but first we need to talk about the origin story. You see, the Knights Templar started off as a very modest endeavor.
The Knights Templar are a really unusual group. They come into existence in the first part of the 12th century, around 1118.
And they were initiated by a French knight by the name of Hugues de Payens. At the time, it was composed of only 8 other people, and they were all volunteers with no external funding. And what's funny is that the order at the time was called the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. And what's interesting is that the very existence of this rather humble knightly order almost came to disrupt Europe's old feudal structure. While most of the ordinary masses saw the Knights Templars as noble heroes, the actual upper class were not too pleased with them.
What's fascinating about the Templars is that an order like them had never existed. In the Middle Ages, we tend to think of society being structured into 3 groups, and those are the nobles, those who fight, the clergy, those who pray, and then everyone else who does all the work to support society. And the Templars were unusual in that they were combining this military aspect of those who fight with the ideal of priesthood or being a monk in a monastery. And so this created a problem for the powers that be at the upper levels of society, and many people were uncomfortable with this.
And this sentiment was all too heightened by the fact that the Knights Templars had a set of privileges that even princes or dukes did not have. On top of that, they were not answerable to any king or lord, and they could move between Christian states as they pleased.
What happened is 2 very important religious figures, Bernard of Clairvaux, who was sort of the religious rock star of the early 12th century, and the Pope support the Templars. And they say, this order is allowed to exist. They answer directly to the Pope. They have special rules and regulations that apply only to them. They get privileges that other groups do not get. And because they had the backing of the Pope and of these other high-ranking religious leaders, they were allowed to come into existence, even though some people were a little uncomfortable with this.
However, in time, they earned the admiration and trust of the most noble, powerful elites for their reliability as warriors and for having a religious sense of honor. And with that came the official support of the knightly order. Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, was the first to lend his support. He gave them funds and set up headquarters on the city's sacred Temple Mountain. It became the source of their iconic name, the Knights Templar. Now, many nobles were willing to support the order at this stage because its members simply could not pose a real threat to their power. This actually sets the scene and provides some context behind why they started acting like money transfer intermediaries eventually.
They were trustworthy because even though they lived as knights, they also swore to follow the rules of monasticism, which is poverty, celibacy, a denial of, creature comforts. And so because of that, they were well respected. They were known to be valiant warriors who always fought to the last man. They were the first ones on the battlefield and the last ones off. They could not hold property themselves. The order held it. Because they were celibate, they had no heirs to pass their property on to. So while they grew wealthy, they did a good job of maintaining the sort of very simple life that a monk would lead. And because of that, they were trusted.
And this trust is what paved the path for the Knights Templar's biggest influence in financial history.
The Knights Templar essentially created the first ATM. And if you think about when that was, we're talking about the 12th century. But the idea of the ATM, the idea that you can put money in to an institution and withdraw it from multiple places, no matter where you are in the world, the Knights Templar made that happen. They say, we need to create an order whose job is to protect the innocent people who are traveling to the Holy Land. And then this in turn develops over the decades and over the centuries into a system whereby not only do they provide physical protection, but they also take people's money or deposits that they'll need for the journey and make it possible for them to withdraw that cash at different points along the way so that they don't have to carry large sums of money with them.
I mean, that sure sounds like an ATM system. And in time, the Knights Templar had the most powerful and wealthiest people in the Christian world as their clients. After all, they had a solid reputation, and they were very convenient. I mean, it was better to deposit money with them than risk being a high-value target on the road.
By the time we get to the 13th century, the royal houses of Europe are trusting the Templars to manage their money and keep their money essentially in the Templar treasury. And this is particularly true for France. They are trusted, they have lots of money, and what's important is that they have a network of castles and fortresses that go all the way from sort of the Templar homeland in the Middle East to the other Templar homeland in what today is southern France, and then on into England as well.
Everyone from the lowest peasant to the most powerful king could trust the Templars to keep their valuables safe. This meant that the knights oversaw a vast pool of wealth that soon came to rival entire kingdoms. Yet, surprisingly enough, there's very little evidence that any of these funds ever got misused. First, there was this religious devotion towards honesty that was expected from their members. In addition, practical measures were also put in place to ensure that funds deposited could never be stolen.
So the order is wealthy, but the individuals are not. And if we look at their account books, and we can do that, they kept pretty good records, you can see that there are certain rules about how many pairs of clothes do they get, how many horses are allocated to each Templar, because of course, if you're a knight, you have to have a horse or you can't do your job. And it's quite clear that if a brother is caught sort of trying to hoard resources or like a really nice mantle or coat for himself, he's going to get in trouble and he'll be punished in some way that the Grand Master of the order sees fit. So they were really, really strict about maintaining this poverty, even as the order itself was hugely wealthy. And because they are monastic, anything that comes in to the order doesn't go out to heirs or anyone else who might inherit.
And such was the integrity of their institution. Not even powerful kings and their armies were entitled to any special treatment. So, the peasants and the lords were treated equally, the same way by the Templars. Now that's a pretty sharp contrast to today, where you have more wealthy clients who can access better services, pay lower fees, and enjoy various other perks at modern banks. In banking systems today, especially for foreign transactions, banks tend to offer less than the market rate, and they keep the difference as fees. Back then, such practices would probably have been considered a great sin. The Knights Templars would protect your money, and you could take it out in any of their branches. And in return, they didn't charge anything.
Usually they did not take a cut. Usually in that case, if you were an average person and you were going to the Holy Land, the money you put in was the money you got out.
But back then, the question is, how did the Templars verify the identity of those looking to make a withdrawal at a different branch of the Templars? I mean, how did they ensure that the transactions were legitimate and that bad actors were kept out of the equation?
So if you are a pilgrim setting out for the Holy Land from, say, France or Spain in the 12th century, in order not to carry a lot of money with you, you would go to a Templar fortress or castle or stronghold, and there's many of them throughout Western Europe. You would make a deposit. They would give you some kind of seal or scrip or notice that indicates exactly how much you had deposited. It would have sort of a code that alerted someone on the other end that this was a legitimate Templar deposit. And then along the way, you could present that at various castles and strongholds that were run by the Templars, and they would give you however much money you needed along the way.
And one could be really sure that the order would keep your money safe. Even kings couldn't come up to the Knights Templar and ask to take money that didn't belong to them. That actually brings us to a really fascinating example.
We have one instance that's a really compelling instance in which King Louis IX of France, he's on the 7th Crusade, fails miserably. He gets captured. And when this happens in medieval warfare, you don't want to kill a high-ranking captive. You want to ransom them for everything you can get. And so the Muslim forces say, we've got your king. We want you to pay us the equivalent of 800,000 bezants, which is an enormous amount of money, something like twice the annual, income of the French nation at this time. So they allow the king to go to his own treasury that he had brought with him. It takes 2 days or something to count out all the money. They're still something like 30,000 bezants short. So they say, all right, let's go to the Templars. And the Templars at this point, who have been supporting the king, who've been leading the charge as he's going on crusade, they actually say, we can't give you this money because it is not ours to give. This is money that's been entrusted to us by other pilgrims, and we need to keep it in trust for them. And so what happens is they have to play out this charade where one of the king's knights threatens to just break into the strongbox and take the money. And then the Templar in charge says, I've upheld my vow. I've tried to prevent you from taking it. Go ahead, take it, but now you're going to owe us 30,000 plus in the months ahead. And that's exactly what happened. And so they tried very hard to maintain an ethical line when it came to maintaining the deposits of everyone from kings to lower ranking people. And if there was an instance where there was an emergency fund that was needed, they got that back from the ruling houses, usually with interest, even though charging interest is technically illegal at this time.
Now, speaking of interest, this was a religious military order directly answerable to the Pope. You would think that engaging in a practice such as usury would be quite a controversy. However, it had a lot to do with how they redefined interest into fees. They would be classified as other charges so that no one could question any better.
One way that they sort of got around the problem of interest, because that's considered sin to charge interest because you are making something out of nothing, essentially, is that they would not call it interest necessarily, but say, all right, if we do this favor for you and let you have this loan, we need you to pay it back, but also can you pay us a fee, which is different from interest, of, so many animals or this amount of gold, or will you give us the right to draw rents from these lands? Are these in our... So that's the way they sort of got around it. But it just made them wealthier and wealthier and wealthier.
But loans weren't their only source of wealth. It wasn't even their biggest revenue source. They were also major landowners. Initially, land was gifted to them to maintain the regional offices and to construct their defenses. Over time, they also came to acquire vast tracts of productive land, trade centers, and other various investments.
In the 13th century is when their wealth really begins to explode, because not only do they have multiple properties, not only have they received all these gifts from people who are grateful to them or want to support the cause. I mean, plenty of rulers, the King of Portugal, I believe at one point left a third of his kingdom to the Templars. So they were getting these big donations. So most of their money actually came from properties that they owned. So if they owned a huge amount of farmland, agricultural land, and sometimes they owned buildings, or they had the right to receive rents from people who had trade shops in a village, that's where a lot of their money came in on an annual basis. So every year, if you held lands or worked lands that were held by the Templars, you had to pay a rent, or you had to pay a certain amount of animals or goods in kind. That's where most of their money came from.
But beyond just a vast property empire, they also came to enjoy a massive advantage in commerce. They had their bases scattered throughout Western Europe and the Near East. In addition, they also operated their own naval fleet for war. These vessels were just as viable for transporting goods. Couple that with the fact that they did not have to pay any fees or custom duties. That's why one can expect them to quickly have dominated the trade of various goods imported from the Middle East.
And just like they were exempt from paying fees on land, they didn't have to pay fees when they entered certain ports like everyone else did. So they were really saving in terms of expenses that they had to lay out. And then they also were able to better manage their own money. Very often they had their resources on ships, say, that would be right offshore where a battle was happening. And they're safe, they're out on the ocean, they're protected. And so they are really becoming kind of their own nation state, their own sort of banking industry.
Now, it's important to recognize that history could have played out very differently. You see, the growing influence and wealth of the Knights Templars posed a growing challenge to the existing feudal order of Europe. By the 13th century, their network of fortresses, estates, and banking operations extended across the continent. Many European rulers found themselves deeply in debt to the Templars. In places like France, the Templars had become the de facto treasurers of the kingdom, managing vast sums of money and even securing state loans. It's probably because of this very influence that they became a target of political backstabbing.
In 1307, on October 13th, there is a dawn raid, and something like all the Templar houses, hundreds of Templars in France especially, in a coordinated attack, are arrested, and they are charged with what seemed to be a whole lot of made-up nonsense. They're accused of devil worship, of sodomy, of any number of blasphemous and idolatrous acts.
And the King of France had his own personal reasons to destroy the Templars. He himself was heavily indebted to the order.
This just seems to be propaganda in order to allow the king to justify the fact that he is bringing all these monk knights into prison, and he's going to confiscate all their goods, which means they don't get to control the French treasury anymore. He does.
The king also targeted the order's Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay. Jacques was invited to the kingdom on some official business, but instead, the only outcome he met was his demise. He and thousands of others were tortured into giving false confession. Many of them were sentenced to burn alive at the stake, including the elderly Grand Master himself. Now, you might be expecting, how could the King of France get away with it? I mean, why didn't people protest, or why didn't the church protest? Why didn't powerful nobles intervene on behalf of the order? After all, the Knights Templar had popular support, right? Well, the truth is, by that time, the order had begun to lose some of its respect in medieval society.
For much of their existence, they were well respected, they were honored, but the last holdings in the Holy Land fall with the fall of the city of Acre in 1291. And after that, people in the West are thinking, well, we've been giving you all this money. We've been supporting you so that you can protect the Holy Land. What are you doing? How come we don't have any territory over there anymore? You didn't do your job. So there starts to be a shift in terms of attitude, that they've failed at what they were supposed to do. And also remember, all along, there were plenty of religious leaders who were really uncomfortable with the idea that these are monks who are allowed to fight like knights. They did not like that mix. So there was always a group that kind of thought the Templars shouldn't exist. This isn't a legit organization. So you have that from the very beginning. Then you have the collapse of the Crusader states, the final fall in 1291. And so sentiment starts to turn against them in the West. And they are regarded as being a little too prosperous. And people wonder, well, where's all this money going? It didn't save Acre. It didn't bring back the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But at the same time that you see this dramatic turn in France against them, and when the Pope finds out, he is furious because the Templars are supposed to answer directly to him. And he gets all of this documentation sent to him where the French king says, I can prove that they've engaged in these terrible, blasphemous activities. And it seems pretty clear that the Pope didn't believe it, but also recognized that enough people did believe that they were engaging in sodomy, that they were worshiping a decapitated head or a black cat or there were all sorts of crazy stories.
And what happened in France was soon followed by the dismantling of the knightly order in many other parts of Europe. So the Knights Order went underground. It had once been one of the most easily recognizable institutions in Europe, and now its members only met in secret to avoid persecution.
Other Templar organizations in other countries start to essentially go underground or disassociate themselves. They might still practice or meet, but they didn't want to call attention to themselves because this terrible thing had happened in France. And this is where you get the idea in sort of modern conspiracy theories that there's a vast Templar conspiracy running the world, and that in the wake of the October 13th pre-dawn raid, that they all went underground, they hid, they developed a much more secret code, they brought treasure, they hid it someplace, including in America, Oak Island. If you've read the Da Vinci Code, that is all about the idea that the Templars have wealth and treasure, and in this case, it's not just physical treasure, it's a secret. And that's where that comes from, when they all sort of had to retreat, go underground, and maybe didn't want to call attention to themselves.
Nevertheless, even as the order seemingly disappeared, their financial legacy and influence did not. The banking practices and systems they developed would be adopted by others, giving rise to a financial revolution in Europe and making finance even more widespread. Indirectly, it would pave the path for the continent's most persecuted minority to flourish, the Jewish community.
In Europe, which is my specialty, we do see a more localized version of this amongst moneylenders in the medieval West. And what happens is, I like to call the 13th century in the medieval West sort of the rise of a persecuting society, which is a term that was first coined by a historian called R.I. Moore, in which what happens is there's a huge increase in population. There's not enough land and resources to go around. And so a number of groups start getting marginalized and told, you can't own property or you can't farm this land. And one group that happens to are the Jews. And they are forced essentially into the banking industry. They are not allowed to, in many countries, to hold land, to farm that land, but they can manage money. And also, because they're Jews, they are not beholden to the rule about interest. And that's one way that a lot of medieval business organizations got around the issue. I need a loan. Who's going to give me a loan with no interest? Well, the Jews will. And so that way I can get my loan. I have to pay interest. And this creates a really negative situation and the rise of a kind of anti-Semitic trope about Jewish moneylenders and Jewish greed, when in fact, we know that's not true. They were forced into this position. They had no other options in many cases for what kind of job they could do. And so it's a problem. And within their local communities, you would have sort of a monetary economic banking network that might be overseen mostly by Jewish moneylenders, but plenty of the local burgesses and workers and craftsmen would play a role in managing that money.
Now, undeniably, the Knights Templar left an indelible mark on the financial history of medieval Europe. The order shaped many practices that would influence banking for many centuries to come. Their story is a testament to how power, wealth, and legacy can intertwine, often with unforeseen consequences. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, I'd love it if you leave a crown emoji in the comment. It would really mean a lot to me. Also, I'm very grateful for Dr. Armstrong's time for this interview. She's written some amazing books and has a lot to share, so make sure to check out some of her work in the description of this video. By the way, if you haven't already, make sure to check out this video I made about the Rockefellers. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.